Hello, welcome to a discussion on the book of Joshua. It's the sixth book of the Old Testament in the Bible. It is the first book after the Pentateuch. And so we're finally past the book of Moses in the Bible survey series that we're working our way through. The intent of the Bible survey is to give you a high level overview of each book of the Bible. I want you to be able to have some background, like who wrote the books of each book of the Bible, when was it written, when was the events in the book carried out, when did they actually occur, and hopefully these will help you piece together all of the books of the Bible. So as you dive deeper into each book of the Bible, as you're doing your Bible studies, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense and give you a better context of each of the books of the Bible. It'll help you understand and translate what you're reading. As I said, this is the sixth book of the Bible, and it is the first book after the Pentateuch. When we first started this series, we broke down the Bible into three sections: foundational, historical, and instructional. And we did this for both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, in the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, which we just wrapped up, is the foundational section. And in that section, it gives a outline of how Israel is supposed to worship God in their daily lives, how they should be treating each other, and how they should be living and treating the nations around them. Now we're getting into the historical section, and the historical section kind of gives exactly what it says: an historical account of how Israel fared in carrying out the instructions found in the foundational section. And then we have the third section of the Old Testament, and that's the instructional section, and that gives more detailed instructional manual of how Israel should be carrying out and fulfilling the foundational sections. Right? So it's just a little bit more detail in how they should be worshiping God. But let's stick with the historical section, and we see that there's 12 books in the Old Testament and only one book in the historical section in the New Testament. As you can see, this is Joshua through Esther. So it's the going to include a lot of the books of the prophets in here. And I think it's a good time also to take a look at the timeline here. So we can see exactly where does the book of Joshua fit in with all the other books of the Bible. Now we can see that we're placing Joshua for today's discussion around 1400 BC. Now, if you recur, if you watched some of the earlier messages on the Pentateuch, we reviewed several different theories on the dates of the books of the Bible. Putting Joshua in at 1400 BC, that is assuming the early view of the Exodus. What does that mean? Well, there's two theories. There's a lot of theories, but we covered a little bit more in depth on two theories, and that is the late date and the early date theories of when did the Exodus happen. And it all revolves around which Pharaoh is believed to be in power when the Israelites were being oppressed, and which Pharaoh was in power when the Exodus actually happened. Now, the late date puts Seti I as Pharaoh during the oppression of the Israelites, and Ramses II as the Pharaoh during the Exodus. And he was Pharaoh during 1290 to 1224 BC. So that would place Exodus in the 1200s. Now, the early date has Thutmose III as the oppressing Pharaoh and Amenhotep II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, he was Pharaoh of Egypt between 1450 and 1424, which allows us to put Joshua at 1400 because, Joshua, the events in Joshua took place roughly 40 years after the Exodus. This is because they, in the story of Exodus, you see that instead of joyfully going into the land of Canaan and accepting what God had promised them, Israel revolted, and God, as punishment, made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1400 is a pretty fair date for Joshua to happen if you ascribed to the early date theory, which is what we're going with and which I generally go with and when I'm studying the Bible. And the reason I do that is because it allows sufficient time for the judges to occur. If you go with the late date, it gives a compressed time between judges and the establishment of Saul as king of Israel. So, all that to be said is we're going with around 1400 for Joshua. Now let's talk about who wrote Joshua. It's easy to think that Joshua was the author of Joshua. Why would they name it Joshua? Other than the fact that he's the main character, he's the one that's leading Israel during the events that took place in the book of Joshua. Now, up until this point, the Pentateuch, we went with Moses as the author. I covered several different theories as to alternative authors of the Pentateuch, but ultimately we continued to go with Moses. I wish it was as clear cut here with Joshua that we could just say, hey, it's Joshua. There are some verses in the book of Joshua that if you read them, you could easily believe that Joshua was the author of that. In verses like 832, where it says, there in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. And then in 24:26, it says, Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. So it clearly states, that whoever was writing the book of Joshua was a contemporary of Joshua. He saw Joshua writing in the law of Moses and the book of the law of God. And there's also other instances where it was very clearly a eyewitness of the events that were writing Joshua. In chapter 5, we see we and us as they're describing the sending of the spies and the crossing of the Jordan, the capture of Jericho. So those type of words make you want to think that it was an eyewitness, again, a contemporary of Joshua. I'm going to go over a very interesting theory. It is a theory that is relatively new in dating at least assigning authorship to the book of Joshua. And this puts the writing of Joshua around 500 BC, which is well after the events in the book of Joshua. Now, this theory claims that a Deuteronomist compiled various works. What the heck does that word mean, Deuteronomist? A Deuteronomist is basically a label that people give to people that adhere to the documentary hypothesis of the Old Testament, which puts the supposed author or compiler of the ancient documents roughly corresponding to the book of Deuteronomy. So basically, the hypothesis of the Old Testament is yet another theory on authorship. And to dive really deep into that would be just beyond the scope of what we're trying to accomplish here in the Bible survey. So anyways, Deuteronomist basically is another theory of authorship of the Old Testament. And the theory around the book of Joshua basically says that there's enough similarities between Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings to point to a common author, a Deuteronomist. Now, the Deuteronomist could be an individual, or it could even be a school of individuals that were basically drawing from different source texts to compile these these books. Basically, Joshua, Judges, Samuel. All that to be said, interesting theory. There's several other ones that you can read about. But I think along the lines of dating the events of the Bible and the writings and who wrote them, these are going to be very interesting questions on the top of my list to Jesus when I see him again in heaven. So that's the timeline and the authorship of Joshua. So what really is the purpose of the book of Joshua? Why was it written? Now, this is being in the historical section of the Bible. It's easy to determine that Joshua gives in the official account is a historical fulfillment of the Lord's promise that Israel would inhabit the land of Canaan. But in this process, in the early parts of conquering the land of Canaan, and it's important to note that not all of the land of Canaan was conquered in the time of Joshua. Now you can imagine the land of Canaan is a pretty large plot of land. And to think that Israel would be able to, one, take it over so quickly, and two, after having the infrastructure needed to rule that land, it just wasn't going to happen overnight. But there's 13 battles that are covered in the book of Joshua. And if we look at that, the first couple here, there's actually 2 slides here that we're going to go over. But looking at the first slide here, we can see that we're going to cover three battles in particular of these 13. 3 of them are a little bit different than the other 10. In fact, some of the 10 only get a verse. So you can see the battle of Makkedah gets 1 verse, right? So the book of Joshua just doesn't go in depth equally among all 13 of the battles. But the first battle we're going to take a look at is the second battle in the conquest of Canaan. We're going to kind of skip over Jericho. That's the most famous, I think, battle of the conquering of Canaan, and I'm just not going to rehash that part of it. But here, the first battle of Ai, we see that Israel lost. Ai was the victor. And we can see that the loss is mostly because of what Achan, son of Carmi, did. After winning the battle of Jericho and taking over that, winning that battle, Achan actually took some of the devoted things that they were supposed to not touch, not supposed to use. And that is the reason that they lost. One of the reasons I think that they lost the battle of Ai. I think also they lost because they just didn't listen to God necessarily, and they rushed thinking that they were just going to steamroll, or they thought they were going to conquer the land of Canaan overnight. But they went without God's instructions to go take Ai. So the rest of chapter 7, after the loss of Ai, we see what they did to correct that problem. They actually stoned Achan and they consecrated themselves. And then we can see in chapter 8, they went back up to Ai and they were victorious. Now, the second battle of interest is the battle that took place right after the victorious battle of Ai, and that's against the 5 kings of the Amorites. And that is the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. Now, these 5 kings went to Gideon and assembled there. Now, they were aware of the peace treaty that Gideon got Israel to sign into. So they actually attacked Gideon, not Israel, knowing that Israel would have to come and defend Gideon because of the treaty that they had signed. So that's what happened. The 5 kings attacked Gibeon, and Israel came to defend them, and they defeated the Amorites. You might be saying, well, Dave, that's not what's special about that. There's another example where Jabin, king of Hazor, formed a similar coalition to fight Israel. And yes, you are right. The northern kings, as we can see on this next slide, when we look at Joshua 11, the northern kings, unlike the Amorites, they did not attack anybody. They were going to attack Israel. That was their intent when they got together at the waters of Meron. But Israel, under God's instructions, following God's instructions, knew what they were going to do, and they preemptively went and attacked them at the waters of Meron. Well, those are the quick overview of the 13 battles covered. Let's take a look at the overview of the different sections of the book of Joshua, and there's 5 of them. The first section is the preparation that the Israelites took to get ready to conquer Canaan, and that's chapters 1 through 5, verse 12. Then we go to the conquest of Canaan, kind of the 13 battles that we just did an overview of. Then it moves into the allocation of the land to the tribes, and that's chapters 13 through 22. And then an epilogue. And I apologize, there's only 4 sections. An epilogue, and that is Joshua's farewell address to the leaders of Israel. So if we jump back to the beginning of the book of Joshua, their preparation of getting ready to conquer Canaan, we're introduced to Rahab. Now, Rahab was living in Jericho, and she was a prostitute. And this is proof that God is going to use anyone that he wants, and he uses everyone. Like, it doesn't matter where you are in life, you can be used by God to fulfill his plans. And in fact, Rahab is a good person to look at if you're struggling with believing that you are good enough to be loved by Jesus. Now, regardless of your past, you are loved. You're good enough to be forgiven. We all are. Now, in chapter about Jericho's knowledge of Israel and what God has already done. So if we look at Joshua 2, verses 9 through 11. Actually, we'll go through 8 through 11. Before the spies lay down for the night, she, meaning Rahab, went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So this is clearly stating that Jericho was very fearful of what was about to happen. They had foreknowledge of the Israelites and what God had done for them. So it's not just that they knew of Israelites, but they knew of God, the God of Israel. Now we finally get to the point where the Israelites are ready to cross. Now the story of Rahab was about them sending spies into Jericho to make sure that they were properly prepared. If we jump to chapter 3:13, we see something that I think is very commonly overlooked in Joshua. And this is the second parting of waters, not necessarily the Red Sea, but of the River Jordan. It says, and as soon as the priests who carry Ark of the Lord the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So this is described a little bit different than the Red Sea. Now the Red Sea is there was a current, but not necessarily as rushing like a river, like the river. But when the Red Sea was parted, both sides stood up in a heap. But here it's saying basically the upstream part where the water is coming is going to stand up in a heap, and the water is going to disappear downstream. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because there's actual archaeological evidence of this happening. In fact, it's not even archaeological evidence, but there's also evidence because in 1927, the city of Adam, which is now called Dimea, there was a landslide that occurred and covered the river, and it stopped the flow for 21 hours. And then after that time, the river just worked its way through, and then water continued to flow down the River of Jordan. Now, it's just interesting that I enjoy when there is historical evidence of occurrences that are covered in the Bible. It's easy for critics would say, well, that's never happened. I mean, how can you stop a river? Well, it's clearly happened naturally, so it's not a stretch to believe that Israelites and God could have caused this event. So that's the first section. They've prepared. Now they're going across the Jordan. This next section is the conquest of Canaan. And again, that's the 13 battles listed here in the book of Joshua. There are many more conquests that are covered in the next couple books of the Bible. Obviously, the most famous battle is Jericho. And again, I'm not going to go in depth of that. The next section is the allocation of the land of the tribes. Now, after all of the land had been allocated to the tribes of Israel, they got to the Levitical priests. Since they were not getting an inheritance, they weren't getting land allotted, but they did receive 48 cities spread out amongst the land that was given to each of the tribes. Now, of those 48 cities, 6 of them were set aside as cities of refuge, 3 on each side of the Jordan. Now, city of refuge is a place where if you accidentally killed somebody, you could go to that city of refuge where the relatives of the person that died could not come and exact revenge on you. So now all the tribes were allocated the land, and the Levites, their cities. And now the 2.5 tribes, so the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh were dismissed to go back to the east side of the Jordan. And here in chapter 22, we see that Joshua warns them, the 2.5 tribes, not to transgress to idolatry when they cross the river Jordan, but to remain faithful to the Lord. And what do? Upon reaching the east side of the river, they build a large altar. They actually built it to the same specifications as the altar outlined in the Pentateuch. So Israel was pretty concerned about this, as you can imagine, and they sent Phinehas and 10 heads of the families, one from each of the tribes of Israel, still on the western side of the Jordan, to investigate. Now, the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh responded to Phinehas, to this investigation, and the accusations that they were going to go back to idolatry. And they said what had really taken place was that they had built this altar not for sacrifices, but to demonstrate a common heritage. It's basically a functional symbol of the unity of the people of God. Basically, they were fearful that they were going to be forgotten from the other tribes of Israel. So Phinehas and the heads of the families were satisfied, and so was Israel on there, that they weren't going into idolatry, but they were just worried. They were fearful that they were going to get left behind. After this section, we get to the epilogue. Now, this is Joshua's final address to the leaders of Israel. This farewell address is very similar to other farewell addresses in the Old Testament. In fact, the similarities is part of what supports the Deuteronomist theory of authorship of the book of Joshua. You can go to the farewell address of Moses in Deuteronomy 31, the farewell address of Samuel in 1 Samuel 12, David in 1 Kings 2, and Solomon, 1 Kings 8. And you'll be able to see the similarities between all of these farewell. So that is an overview of the book of Joshua. I hope this helps put some puzzle pieces together as you dive deeper into Joshua. You'll be able to understand, when did the events of Joshua take place, who could have been some of the authors of Joshua, and just where it sits in the overall picture of the Old Testament. If you like this, I hope you subscribe so you can see all the other books of the Bible as we work our way through the survey of the Bible. Have a great day.